today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some research that we've done using some proprietary tools and methods, which again I will get into around generative AI and the impact that has on the workforce. Before I sort of completely jump into the data, just a little bit of context, and hopefully this isn't hugely surprising or new to most people, but ultimately the world of work is in a state of rapid flux. Like there's lots of change going on. The reason why this market is so interesting at the moment is largely because there is so much change. So how do we deal with that? That's everything from huge technological shifts, which we all see every day, and obviously comes into different hyperscales with different technologies that come. We're talking about generative AI, the current hyperscale technology, and we're seeing that 85% of transformations in businesses are largely driven by technology. Equally, the kind of process and the sort of change within green transition and the need for reducing carbon emissions and net zero, sort of objectives set by governments, and therefore those impacts on organisations is driving a lot of change, as well as frankly just the demographic change and people coming into the workforce actually having to change roles multiple times through their career. So we're now seeing almost a 12 times job change within a single career. So in order to do that, it's going to require a bunch of reskilling, of changing your role. And then finally, talent shortages. We're seeing that come up in many of our clients talking about actually talent is now equally as important as capital when it comes to board level discussions. So this is a critical topic that I think we all need to be aware of and keep taking notice of. The second sort of base statement that we make, and as part of the role, the assertion we've made is that we actually think the human capital market is broken. The reason why we think that's broken is because ultimately we make decisions on fundamentally flawed data. Okay, if you think about any other decision we make in business or in life, we look at the data that we have. Things like financial data, it's very well understood. Operational data, very well understood. Supply chain data, very well understood. We can track it, we can see it, we understand it. It's comparable. If you think about how you measure human capital or talent, what do we use? What is that? How do you measure? What's an ounce of talent mean? What does talent taste like? There's no common definition, and so what we use your highest level of education and your last job, and frankly that just reinforces social inequalities. If you think about the sort of initial job placement, that's largely hinged on your educational background, which is heavily correlated with the socioeconomic status of your parents. And so it tends to prioritize past accomplishments over future potential. So what do we say? We say we need to think differently about this market and differently about data. And so solving that human capital data problem is something that we at Pearson are very passionate about. There's a lot on here, and I'm not going to go through the detail, but the things that I want to bring up is, well, so what? We need to think differently if human capital data, the human capital market is broken, and we need to solve the human capital data. And the measure that's coming to prevalence at the moment is skills. That may change over time. We may find other better measures, but the current best measure that we're seeing being adopted is the measure of skills. I still don't think there's a common framework, a common scale that is universally understood. And again, we all have different approaches to that, and we've got some that I'll share today. But we think that's a really important component. So we're seeing organisations move to this skills-based organisation, and that is a way of trying to think differently about how you recruit, how you mobilise people, how you upskill people, how you train them in order to be able to get them from one role to another. And I would posture that we should think about not what people have necessarily done, but what they can do. And so I think about skills in a way that is a bit like Lego bricks. So if you think about, if I'm a Lego car today, perhaps, and each one of those bricks is a set of skills. Rather than only being a car tomorrow, we can break those skills down and build them back up into something different, which might be a motorbike, or it might be something entirely different that isn't a means of transport. But it means that you can start to think about your career path in a very different way, or your team's career path, or your organizational structure in a very different way, because you can move people around and apply them to different solutions. So I'm going to jump into the research we've done and the findings that we've got specifically around the impact of generative AI on jobs. I'll start with a little bit with what we did, and I'll try not to get too techie because there's quite a bit of detail in here, and I can get very lost in the sort of minutiae of science. But in essence, we took census data from across 5 different countries. We plugged that into Pearson's proprietary occupational ontology, which is a combination of jobs, skills, and tasks. Okay, and these are very important concepts. The fact that jobs connected to has a component of skill to be able to do that job, and it has a component of task that is the job that you do. So what it allows us to do is to do some really interesting analysis. And so we have over 5,000 jobs in that particular ontology. We have over 26,000 tasks. And what we then looked at is, okay, what's the technology impact of on those tasks? So we can look at over 30 different technologies, and in this case, generative AI being the technology we've chosen, and we can look at the adoption curve and the development curve of that technology, and we can say, over time, which tasks will be done or can be improved or can be removed by which technologies. So in this case, which tasks can be done by generative AI. And if we understand that at that level of detail, of 26,000 tasks, we can then map that back to jobs and identify which jobs generative AI is likely to be able to support or augment or automate. So that's essentially the model. We looked at the UK, US, Brazil, India, and Australia as countries, and assessed which jobs are most and least impacted, and that's what I'm going to talk through now. So the first sort of key finding was that generative AI will have a greater impact on white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs over the next 10 years. That may or may not be surprising to you, but we go into many more levels of detail than just this key finding, and I'll talk about that. But in essence, just between the most impacted white-collar and most impacted blue-collar roles, there was a 14% task difference. So in terms of your amount of time we spend on tasks, those top roles that are impacted by generative AI, white-collar jobs are impacted 14% more heavily than the blue-collar ones. And I'll get into a little bit of detail. We found that 30% or more of the tasks involved in the working week of some white-collar roles can be done by generative AI. So 30% of a job, generative AI can replace. Now, that's got some fairly big ramifications and fairly big impacts, right? Because that means you need to think about, well, what do I do with my workforce? What if I've got 1,000 people doing that job? Well, that's 30% of those people. And there's options. And the reason why we look multiple years out is because we want to give people the foresight to be able to take the right actions in order to be able to unlock the productivity gain of that 30% in this particular instance. So that might be, okay, how do I take, if it's 1,000 people doing that job, how do I take those 300 and how do I redeploy them within my organization so that I can get more productivity gain? What skills can they take with them and add so they can do something new and more productive for my organization? So it's a really important sort of reskilling agenda rather than a current short-termism, which is a fire and rehire model where you have to, remove people that you think to make your savings, but then you have to hire people at a very high value that you need for other reasons. We also found that less than 1% of a blue-collar worker's job in a working week could be done by generative AI. So, we know, and you probably have seen some of the applications of generative AI already with things like co-pilots and open AI that people use to kind of speed up their kind of copywriting or marketing or legal documents, whatever it might be, it doesn't really help you when you're a carpenter or you're or, a window cleaner or whatever these things might be. It's very hard for generative AI to do those tasks. So that's what we're seeing there. And so if I sort of jump into a bit more detail just to kind of illustrate the examples, and I've got one for white collar and one for blue collar here, the top five and least five impacted roles within a white collar sector are these. So you'll see that medical secretaries, communication operators, bookkeepers, or payroll managers. These are roles that are heavily impacted by generative AI, and you can understand why, I hope, because there's a lot of repetitive tasks in those roles. There's a lot of administration type roles, and so you could see that those things some of those tasks can be replaced. On the flip side, some of the less impacted roles, so senior executives, senior officials, civil engineers, interestingly, largely because and fairly well reported, sort of generative AI at the moment is not great at the mathematical side. So when you're getting into high complex mathematics within a role, then that's relatively generative AI safe, if you like. Although there may be other technologies that come along and impact that. We're looking solely through the generative AI lens at the moment. But other sort of distribution and interesting non-commissioned officers and military roles, which are considered as white collar, are still sort of not impacted in quite the same amount. Coming on to the blue collar roles, I'm checking I'm doing okay for time. You can see here that the least impacted roles, 0%, because frankly, if you're a grounds person or a painter or a decorator, there's very little that generative AI is going to do for you, and so we don't see any of those tasks being done by generative AI. On the flip side, there are some roles, largely again, where there's heavy administration around organising of events or scheduling, and coordination. Then that often can be done through generative AI, and so we see those tasks being impacted. And in this case, the highest impacted role is a sort of procurement officer, having 27% of their role being impacted by generative AI. So just to finish, then, what does that mean for us? What do we need to do as organisations that support that support people in work and support companies and governments trying to think through this problem? Well, there's a bunch of things that we should be thinking about. We should be thinking, particularly for white collar workers, well, how do we adapt? How do we think about how we sort of help those people in those roles to learn and change and develop their skill set so that the skills are relevant, the tasks they do are relevant, and that they can benefit from generative AI or other technologies rather than simply fall foul of them. The upskilling is an obvious one, and we're going to talk more about that and ways that we can bring that into organizations at scale, particularly with the underpinning skill component that we talked about earlier. And then how do you actually leverage AI in order to make yourself more productive, to save that time and therefore do the things that are of higher value? And it might mean you do more of the tasks, spend more time on the tasks that are currently are not affected by generative AI because they can provide more value or provide more output. So if you think about coders as an example or developers, we can see how generative AI is going to start to impact those roles from a productivity point of view, but the need and the demand for those roles is still incredibly high. So all it's doing is it's unlocking capacity in the system that is currently at a squeeze point. So if you go back to my very first slide, I talked about talent shortages and the fact that there are multiple talent shortages in areas, and that's a big problem for organizations. So we shouldn't see AI always as a threat, but actually as an opportunity to solve that. And so that's where the improving productivity component comes in. And we should, as organizations, act responsibly about this and think about how do we unlock talent, how do we unlock productivity, and how do we support people who potentially are going to be impacted and affected over the next 5+ years with new technologies, and proactively help them move, both for the benefit of the career of your employees, but also for the benefit of your organisation. So I'll stop there because I think I'm about 10 or so minutes, maybe a couple extra, Gary, but I think we'll move into the Q&A. That makes sense?
Yeah,
I'll try
absolutely.
and stop share.
Thanks, Ollie. I dropped 2 links in the chat to research on Pearson's website where you can read a little bit more about what Ollie spoke about there. And if you have any questions about the data, feel free to drop those in the Q&A box and we can come back to them later. Nelson, over to you. We've seen, some great numbers there on the impact on the job market, especially if we think about the white collar jobs and what Ollie mentioned around the challenge of upskilling and reskilling at scale. So, what can be done about that?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie, for sharing that, because I think that's super insightful and really useful data of kind of looking at what the impact has been. And I think what I really want to underline from what Ollie shared was this change is exponential. And often humans, we have a tendency to underestimate what exponential change means. Like there's great examples of this. People say, there's research that suggests humans typically underestimate compound interest. Because we don't really understand how quickly compound interest can grow. And it's really important to appreciate how quickly that can change. And I actually think looking at generative AI itself, so if you take the first GPT model that came out about 5 years ago, it was looking at 100 million parameters to do what it was doing. So it could do your kind of basic functional conversational tasks. Today, GPT-4 looks at 500 billion parameters to do what it does, right? That's exponential change. Now let's frame exponential change and compare that with how we've been approaching upskilling and reskilling within organizations. Even prior to generative AI, we were doing a pretty bad job. Hence the reason why the half-life of skills was significantly starting to reduce. And so, governments around the world, organizations were very aware of the fact that a growing segment of the workforce were at risk of not having the skills to get work done or to be able to get jobs that they needed. Now you throw generative AI into the mix and speed things up even more. And what that points out is it's going to take a lot more than incremental change to solve this problem. And so let's look at how we've approached it and what's not going to work. The way we think about upskilling and reskilling within a workplace context has a hangover from education. And I mean education from how we did it at schools, how we did it at universities, which were primarily optimized for distributing content, right? There's a reason why there's a lecturer at the front and there's about 1,000 students in the room, because it's optimized for distributing content. And at the end, they assess whether you read and understood the content or not in an exam. But we're not validating if there's a real world application of what you've just learned. That's what's significantly different about the workplace. Because in the workplace, what we want to know is, can you apply what you've learned or not? Do you have the skill is the question. And that's why we need to move away from this traditional education approach, which is very content first. And it's focused around asking, what content do people need and how am I going to get this content to them? And instead, if what we need to really be doing is build the skills that your organization and the world needs, then we need to put skills first. And we need to change the question we're asking ourselves within the organization. And that question needs to be, what skills do my people need? And how am I going to help them build those skills? And I think that fundamental kind of paradigm shift in the way we think about upskilling and reskilling needs to happen if we're going to go anywhere near close to keeping up with the level of change we're seeing.
Ollie, any thoughts from you on what Nelson shared there? I mean, it is so true, isn't it, that we've focused on distribution, we've focused on content, we've not focused necessarily on skills as the sort of key driver of the learning we do in companies.
I mean, 100%. It's not a surprise that Nelson and I are aligned on this, given that we spent the time we thought about this problem together to come on this call. But I mean, I see it, and we see it all the time, that the proliferation of non-traditional educational routes into work is growing, right? So, we as Pearson, we operate in schools, we operate in universities, we operate through the whole life of learning. And frankly, the last 10 or 15 years, the higher education market has been in decline. Okay. And so why is that? Really, if you start to unpick why is it, it's that, and then coming back to that point I made at the beginning, it is because it doesn't necessarily fit the system that it's feeding people into. Now, it still has huge value. I don't want to devalue higher education as a total process, but it still is the biggest proxy and it's the biggest thing we use as we start to change what we value in work and how we measure skill, how we measure talent, and in our case, we advocate for skills. Then universities are having to change and they're having to think differently about what they churn out as a product, because ultimately their product is their graduates, right? And I think they are moving to find alternative types of training and delivery, and so is and access work to be able to support employers. And I think those at the forefront of the higher education market are doing it well, and they're not. This is controversial, perhaps. They're not usually the traditional universities. They're the challenger universities, because your traditional ones, they don't need to change yet because their brand is so strong. People still value their graduates so highly. There's still huge demand to go. It's the tier down from that are really changing and pushing at this. So from a supply side, that's interesting. And then you've got the proliferation of things like boot camps and particularly the tech space to train people for work very quickly. That's massively getting bigger, and I think we're going to see that come into other markets as well. And so we just need to be able to help people navigate this system, this like, what is the right path for me? And that's, I think, what we advocate for in both from Nelson and myself around in work. We do that. We also need to go back down into the classroom and into kids as they think about coming into the workplace. What's the right path for them, and how do we value it? And that will change. I think it's probably got another decade to run, but I think it's definitely moving.
Yeah. What's nice is that it doesn't seem like there's a lack of appetite. It's just knowing how to do it, how to use tools and tech to solve the skills problem. And what's interesting is AI kind of comes into the conversation in two ways. One, people kind of accuse it of being the thing that disrupts everything and steals our job. And on the other hand, people were saying that it's the way that we can actually build the skills we need quick enough to change. So, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it's currently being used to tackle the skills crisis, and I guess what the sort of improvements or tweaks you'd make on those would be.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick this off. I think right now we're still very early days in terms of, is it actually being used for upskilling and reskilling and tackling the challenge. I think if you look at the application of AI and specifically generative AI within a learning and development context, it's largely being used right now for efficiency gains. And you often see this when a new technology comes in. We try to do the same thing we were always doing, but with this new technology, right? Like if you look at when we shifted from paper books to ebooks, we created the book in an ebook format, right? And you see this every time a new wave of technology comes in, and it takes a while before we kind of go back to first principles and ask the question of actually, what could we do natively with this technology that we couldn't have done in the old format? And I think we're moving in that direction. So what the large kind of usage is around, and going back to the efficiency point, is content creation. Again, a very content first approach, right? And let's genuinely ask ourselves a question: was lack of content ever the problem that was holding us back from closing skills gap? And it wasn't, right? And already there was a problem with the fact that there's a ton of content out there. We're living in a post-content world where content is both cheap and abundant. And actually the hardest problem to solve is discovery. How do I find the relevant content that's contextually relevant to me? Now, that was already a difficult problem. Now let's throw, again, generative AI into the mix. That kind of 10x's that problem. And so ironically, generative AI might be scaling the very problem we wanted it to solve, with information overload, lack of contextual awareness. And so we could end up making it more difficult for us by throwing more content at employees from a learning perspective. And then the other primary use case is automation, right? Automation of routine tasks. Now, don't get me wrong, who doesn't like automation of admin tasks? We all do. But there is still that question of, are you automating the right tasks, and are you automating them in the right way? Right. And if you went to your boss and you said, you know what, I completely missed my target, but at least I missed my target more efficiently, you're not going to get away with it. And so it's really important that you're applying that efficiency gain to be more effective. And so what we're starting to see, and we're doing this and working alongside Pearson, is using AI to essentially understand those fundamental questions around what skills do people need, right? Like Ollie touched on earlier around what's the impact of emerging technology? What's the impact of changes that are happening in the macro environment? And we can use AI to start to go, well, this is what they should be working on or building as a skill. And then we can use AI to kind of infer where are they at, right? This is what they should have, but what's the proficiency level they're at right now? What level of mastery do they have for that skill? And then be able to bridge that gap in a meaningful way. And I think that's where we're starting to use generative AI to bridge that gap. And I think that's where we'll start to see the shift, is to use AI to be more effective, not just to be more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Ollie, from your side, how do you see that, the way it's currently being used and what the, the improvements or tweaks you would make are?
I think from my point of view, the kind of we look at this through two ways, right? One is what's the problem that AI is solving in the world of work, to Nelson's point, effectiveness and productivity gains, and actually this is, to me, we need to look at it as an opportunity in order to be able to like solve those talent shortage gaps. And so we need to be much more strategic as governments policy, and there's some comments in around formal education systems and how long they take to solve, and I hugely agree with that. We need to think about how we train people with the base core skills through life so that they come in with that one. Interesting, one of our previous bits of research identified what we call power skills. So what are the things that the skills that are kind of, regardless of the technology, going to be important to you in the future? And one of the top 5 skills in that space was adaptability, but also the ability to learn, which is really interesting, I thought, because what essentially it's saying that and again, the summary of that research essentially said human skills over technical skills are the ones that are the most core, right? They're the ones that are going to generate, you need to carry through life, because you'll have to learn technical skills multiple times because they'll change, right? You'll change on the platform you're using, you'll change on the sort of the area of technical expertise you want to be in may change, but the core component of people's work is still human, right? And so how do we use technology in the best way to create effectiveness and productivity and unlock value for people, for organizations, and for countries? But then how do we think about the human skills that help us unlock those technologies? And so to me, that's where the focus needs to be as we evolve, when we think about everything from formal education, but also into the work context from a learning point of view. So that's the sort of overall problem. And then, I think we'll talk a bit more into this. Then it's about, okay, how are we using AI to solve this problem? And that's obviously what some of the data that I showed to give us insight and help provide insight to our clients, both at a government level that are setting education policy, at an organizational level that's talking about L&D spend, but also more importantly about their talent and their workforce and how do they plan and think about that in the future. So I think they're the sort of 2 ways I look at it.
Yeah. Like you said, it's a nice segue, Ollie, into how we can actually use AI to tackle the skills problem in practice. And you mentioned a little bit about how you're doing it. So yeah, kind of tell us about that from a Pearson perspective.
Yeah, happy to. And maybe just a little bit of context. When we set out in this particular market, I said it was a new area for Pearson about 3 years ago. And so I've been fully immersed in that for that period, as sort of looking at the strategy. We came up with a thesis that I presented at the beginning around human counterpart being broken, the big shifts. And then when we looked at, well, what do you need to be able to solve that problem? And where should Pearson play to solve that problem? And what have we got to solve that problem? We looked in our sort of look back into our organization, and there was actually very little at the time. And so we've built that over the last few years. And one of those was through an acquisition we made. We made a couple of acquisitions, but one of the core ones was, we said you need to have this common currency of skill. So this measurement piece was really important. The other area we said you need to have if you've got currency that helps you translate what talent is, i.e. skills, and we can define skills in a common way, which I've shared a bit of that, and I'll go into that a bit more in a moment. The other thing you have to have is essentially a bank account Right. So if you think about current, if you think of the financial side, you've got currency that allows you to translate pounds to dollars and euros to dollars or whatever it might be. We also need a bank account personalized that says this is how much pounds or dollars or euros I have in my bank accounts. These are the skills that I have. So they were two really important components that we felt unlock this system. And so we've now got both of those things, which is great. And we work with Nelson and you guys as well around that too. But if I think about the skill currency and what we can do with that system that we've built, it basically allows us to take data from, as I said, a census level in one case, or from an HRIS system within an organization, and we can give very, very quickly a view of the skills within your population set. And that population set can be 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. We've done the whole of the UK, so 70 odd million people. We've done the state of Texas, so it's a scalable model that allows us to say, these are the skills you have in your organization today, or your population set today. Because we've got the technology view and we do a labor market view as well, we can say these are the skills you're going to need in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, based on the science that we've put together. And so that immediately gives you a different perspective on how you think about planning for your workforce, your organizational workforce, or your population set as a government and making skills policy. So that gives you a way of going, okay, these are the big muscle moves I have to make. And again, there's reference in the chat around like the length of time it takes for governments to put these things in place. Well, it does take time. So we need foresight. Now, foresight is never perfect because no one can predict the future perfectly, but it gives you a much better view and a much stronger perspective of what are the core skills we should be building for. But equally, how do we think about moving my accountants? Take an example of a big four accountancy firm, and I used to work in one. How do you change the role of the accountant, because that's going to be impacted by technology, when you've got a bunch of accountants? By the way, big four accountancy firms have quite a lot of these people. What do we do with them? How do we reskill when actually there's going to be a big demand for data scientists in the future? Funnily enough, we can show you how close an accountant is to being a data scientist, and we can show you the gap between A and B, so you can start to think about what you might put in place to take people from A to B. So that's, I know, a slightly longer answer, but just to give the context of where we come from, how we thought about the problem, and ultimately what we're doing about it.
Yeah. Nelson, a couple of the big themes in there were mapping, were measuring, and they're often very daunting, very hard challenges to solve. So how do we start doing that in practice in a way that matches the speed and scale we need to do it at?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point what Ollie touched on in terms of even that process of understanding what skills your workforce needs and should have. If you look at how the traditional way you would have done that, and some of you on this session may have done it yourself. You go to your people managers and ask them, what skills should this person with this job title have? And they will then come up with a list. And if there's the same job role in multiple departments, they all think they're special with a special list of skills. And so it's really hard to come up with this standardized skills framework for your organization in terms of what's expected. And that's just to get, like, they should have skill X. But then you've also got to understand to what level of proficiency should they have that skill, because you don't need everyone to have a level 5 in every skill that they have. And so you were doing that just based on subjective data you were getting from the people within the organization. But actually what you're able to do now is leverage a significantly larger data set to strip out any of those biases and restrictions and limitations to get a more comprehensive view of what skills someone with that job title, more importantly, someone with that task and responsibility requires. Where we kind of connect from there is now you know what they need to have. You need to know what they actually have. And that's where skills assessment comes in. It's a critical piece. You need to know to what level of proficiency do people in your organization have that particular skill. And this is where the practical way of doing that is organizations we work with use HowNow to do a 360 skills assessment. So we essentially combine self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment to give you an average proficiency level for the skills that you have. Now, why do we take a 360 approach? Well, let's explore the alternative. The alternative would be, I give you a test, right? You sit down for 2 hours, you do a test. Our philosophy is just because you aced an exam, it doesn't make you great at your job. But actually, what does make you great at your job is if you're able to learn something, acquire that skill, and apply it within a work context. And the best people to evidence that are the people you work with, right? Like if I'm now a better project manager, the best people to evidence that are the people that I work with who can now say, actually, Nelson's project management skill is now level 4 and not a level 3. And so that 360 assessment is also deliberately light touch. It makes it easier for you to kind of continuously check in. Now that you know what skills are required and what skills you have and what skills each individual has, then becomes the challenge of how do you connect people with relevant learning that's going to bridge those skills gaps, right? And this has always been a challenge. It's always been a challenge because learning is scattered, right? Most of the learning that any one of us need on this session doesn't live in one place. It definitely doesn't live inside your LMS, inside your organization. You know, there's e-learning in your LMS, there's blogs, podcasts, third-party courses, there's webinars, there's ebook. There's a ton of learning resources that are scattered both inside and outside of the organization. Not only are they scattered, they also don't speak the same skills language. You know, Ollie touched on this earlier around the importance of having that currency that standardizes it so we can convert and translate. But each one of these different providers and resources speak a completely different skills language. And so this is where, again, we leverage generative AI to be able to look at all of the learning experiences and resources you have in your learning ecosystem. So that could be an internal expert, it could be a course, it could be a book, a blog, etc. And to map those to the skills that you're trying to build in your organization. Now, what that mapping of your learning ecosystem does, it improves the discovery of relevant learning, because you now know, well, if I'm trying to go from a level 3 to a level 4 in project management, I can now find the specific learning resources in my ecosystem that are going to help me build those skills. And also from a reporting of impact perspective in an organization, as an organization, I can now say, well, L&D spent X amount of money on this learning and actually aligns directly to the skills gaps that I wanted to close, which is a huge kind of impact on how efficiently you could spend your learning budget, because you can now double down on the learning resources that are really working and cut back on the ones that are not helping you close the gaps that you need to. And the last one I want to touch on what we can also do with using generative AI is, previously we could only really personalize learning pathways at a cohort level, right? Or at a segment level. I could say everyone with this job role needs to have this learning pathway. But as we know, we all have different experiences and abilities within that particular cohort. But what this mapping of your learning ecosystem, which we at HowNow call the skills graph, and what that allows you to do is you can now personalize pathways to a employee level. Right, so I, as a people manager, can now go in and create a pathway that directly addresses the skills gaps of every employee in my team. And that's how we're going to be able to upskill and reskill employees at both speed and scale. But that's how we're seeing practically organizations doing that using HowNow to solve that problem.
Ollie, any thoughts from you on that before we move into?
Yeah, just one thing to add, and it's sorry, I'm doing this. So I agree very much with Nelson's sentiment. That the one thing that I maybe have to say yes and is around the assessment of skills. And you would expect me to say that, as coming from Pearson, as an organisation that's probably the biggest assessment company in the world. There are many ways to assess skills, and I saw Raj put in a note in the chat. Apologies, a bit of background noise. I've got a man in a high vis outside doing something that's noisy. So there are many ways to assess skills, and 360 is with people around you is definitely one of those. I would advocate for multiple models though, and actually the way I think about this is verification or validity of skill. So if you think about, I'm a level 3, or and this is where Pearson has a big thing around, okay, how do we know that someone has got that skill? Is it been verified? Who's been verified by? What level? What does that mean? And so, of course, the 360 view is right, but there's others as well. And there are obviously professional bodies that present and can tell you that you've reached a certain level that has currency and has meaning as well. And so when I come back to that point around a bank account, the other acquisition we made was a company called Credly, which is essentially a digital credentialing business that holds credentials from over 4,000 providers in one place. And so that information is verified by the third party who issued that credential, and is a really great thing to supplement the 360-degree assessment as well. And Raj, you referenced other ways, and I do see the world of assessment evolving quite rapidly over the next few years and decade, particularly with generative AI and the ability to read, assess, and look at things in a different way. So take, for example, English language learning. Okay, so traditionally, we have a big English language learning division. We look at, we assess people for the purposes of visas, so high stakes, high importance. I want to go into a country. I need to prove my English is good enough. That's a really important step for somebody's life. Okay, so it's not small BA. You can't just do that with a 360. You've got to do that effectively, right? But we currently do that in a certain way. There are certain tests you have to do. You have to show up and do a conversation, yada, yada. We used AI to assess all of those things because we have the rubrics to do so. But if you take that a step further into how do you assess in the flow of work? Well, do you need someone to turn up for an hour to do that? Or can we watch people in their team's environments, if they allow us, for a day or a week or 3 weeks or whatever it might be, and say, we're going to look at this over a period of time. We'll take the information from your video and see how competent you are at speaking. It's a completely different model. You don't have to turn up at a test center. You don't have to do anything. It's just saying, if you allow us to watch your engagement, and it's not looking at proprietary or IP information, it's just how you speak or how you write or whatever that might be. It allows us to assess in a different way. I'm not saying we're doing that yet. We have the capability to, but you can see how that illustrates a different type of assessment, hopefully answering your question, Raj, and also adding to Nelson's 360 point.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely like that, Ollie, and we agree in terms of the evolution of assessments, and we've been doing R&D around this, where specifically for a sales organization, where we were using generative AI to plug in productivity data and infer a level of proficiency based on that. So just to give people insights into the research that we did, so we plugged in a bunch of sales tools that gave us different data. So everything from a call recording tool that records all of the sales demos, etc. We then combined that with data that was coming from a sales CRM, which tells us, how long has it taken someone to close a deal, and what are the touch points, etc. And looking at that data, we can then start to benchmark what the best performers were doing. So we could say the best performers were doing, they were closing deals in 3 months, and they would often have 20 touch points versus someone who was doing 5 touch points. Combining the call data with just the CRM data, we could then start to form a benchmark and infer that based on someone's productivity and performance data, this is the level they're at. And that opens up a whole type of real-time skills assessment opportunity that goes back to, Gary, your question around how do we do this at speed and scale? Well, this is how we're going to do it at speed and scale. But I do think it's important, the point Ollie made around the kind of combination of different assessments, because each one of these, the subjective assessment, the objective assessment, the performance inference, they give you different insights. And it's about triangulating using those different data sets to come to your conclusion. But yeah, it's exciting, this space, in terms of what could happen.
Yeah. Nelson, that's actually...
I bet, because I'm going to just add to one more. That example is a great one, Nelson. And we did a bit of work with a very large organization that I can't name, but looking at their sales force, and exactly that, we looked at performance data, and then we did an assessment of their soft skills. So we used some of our psychometric assessments to basically understand and profile. So then we could start to identify what the correlation was. So then they could change their training and change some of how they communicate the team in order to drive performance up of the overall sales team. So we took the performance measures, we took a bunch of other assessments, and then we were able to triangulate. So yeah, spot on.
Awesome. Nelson, I think that's a good segue into the kind of closing slide you had around how this looks in practice. So if we'll go to that now, and then while Nelson's talking, if anyone has any questions, please do drop them in the chat, because we'll go to the Q&A just after that.
Yeah, so one of the things we're keen to talk about and go back to it with these sessions is not just to give you kind of a bunch of data and theory, but also to give you practical, organizations that both are working with Pearson and HowNow, are doing this today, right? They're solving these problems in the ways that we've just discussed in this session. And so just kind of to give you an overview of how that works, how the Pearson and HowNow partnership works, is essentially with our joint offering, what you'll be able to do is look at what skills you have. So benchmark the skills that you need inside your organization, identify which of those skills that you have, and to be able to assess which degree of proficiency you have those. So fundamentally, the outcome is you can understand your workforce, identify what the skills gaps are that are holding your organization back. And then, like I mentioned earlier, your learning right now is probably scattered inside and outside with multiple tools and third-party providers. What we'd help you do is bring all of your learning together into a single searchable platform and map your entire learning ecosystem to your organization's skills framework. So you can start to align every learning resource, every expert, back to the skills that you want to build as an organization. And then now that you've built that mapping, you can now connect every employee with relevant learning in the flow of work, right? So I've just been promoted as a first-time manager. We can leverage that talent data coming from their HR system to assess what skills they have and need to have, and then connect them with a relevant learning pathway that's going to help them progress to that next stage. And so you can really engage and develop people with personalized learning. And the last one is for you to be able to demonstrate impact. And so, the reality is your C-suite and employees don't care how much content you've completed or how much time you spent learning. What they want to know is the amount of money that we've invested in learning and development, has that helped build the skills that the organization needs to see? And so what you would have is a one-stop shop for all of your L&D data that helps you track the engagement with all of the learning that you've offered and how much money you've spent, but also to be able to directly connect that spend to the skills that you've developed. So it makes it easier as an L&D and people team for you to build an impact narrative around the work you're doing. And so that's a kind of an overview of how Pearson, working alongside HowNow, are able to kind of identify those skills gaps and connect it with relevant learning and help you demonstrate the impact you're having on skills and development. And so you essentially end up with this one home for learning and skills, working with Pearson and HowNow.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nelson. I mean, I know that impact point will resonate with people. I've seen some of the recent research, and impact and showing impact and ROI are still so high on the list of all the things people want to do. So you heard a bit about Pearson and HowNow throughout the session and in what Nelson just shared there. I'm going to launch a poll now that will ask you if you want to learn a little bit more about HowNow, Pearson, both, or you're okay with what you've got right now. So if you'd like anyone from HowNow or Pearson to get in touch with you about this, then just tick the right option on that poll there and we'll be in touch. Perfect. All right, we've got time for a few questions. We've done well. We've covered a lot. So pat on the back. Kudos to us. Yeah, drop your questions in the Q&A in the chat. I'll just come back to, it kind of overlaps a question we maybe didn't get to with Idal's one in the chat here, but examples of the application of AI. So I'd love to know how you're seeing, customers and clients successfully tackling the skills challenge or specific problems with AI. I know, Ollie, you shared one, but I mean, Nelson, is there any more that come to mind?
Yeah, I think a lot of the examples we kind of touched on earlier, we're starting to see, we work with a large organization who surprisingly had done quite a lot of manual work and were still in the progress of trying to map and figure out what skills they have. And they did it quite like what I mentioned earlier, a lot of working with people managers, and they're mapping all of this out in a spreadsheet. And they realized, it's probably going to die in a spreadsheet because whose job is it to keep this up to date and look after it? But also they were missing out on a lot of the useful stuff Ollie mentioned around like what's the impact of emerging tech, and what are the emerging skills, because you don't want your people investing time in a skill that's going to be redundant in the next 2 years. You want them to spend their time on skills that are really going to matter over the next couple of years. And so they recognized those challenges and made that shift towards using our platform to be able to identify those skills and map their ecosystem. We've got another organization that had like over 20 different learning content sources, from a LMS that they had for compliance to third-party content libraries, but they just didn't know, did they have all the resources they needed to plug the skills gaps? They didn't know. Did they have content gaps? They couldn't really assess that. And again, they used our mapping of a learning ecosystem to to get an understanding of, do they have the learning resources to plug those gaps or not? So it's definitely in the early days, but it's really, really great. I mean, we've been doing this for a few years now, and I definitely think in the last year or two, the shift towards organizations understanding that they need to look at the work through the lens of skills is really, really changing now, right? And I think a big part of that is the C-suite are asking the question, right? Where before they weren't asking, did you complete this course or not? Now you've got CEOs asking, do we have the skills to get the work done, right? And so L&D and people teams need to be able to answer that question.
Ollie, from your perspective, I know you shared one briefly, but are there any other examples that come to mind?
I think it depends on the angle of the question. If it is how are organizations using AI to improve their organization, then there's a bunch, right? Are we implementing AI in organizations from a direct point of view? No, because that's not what we're trying to do. But are we looking at the impact of AI and using our AI tools to analyze that? Yes, in many. And so if I think about areas of kind of focus, or areas that we spent quite a lot of time in, if I think about major banks, big area where they look for gain through technology, and actually therefore the use, whether it be generative AI or other technologies, therefore the use of forecasting around skills is really important to them. We do it in life science, in insurance, in sort of almost all sectors, automotive. These are organizations that have large workforces, often distributed. They have frontline workers as well as heavy amounts of administration, and so you can see how different technology is going to impact. We look at robotic process automation, we look at manufacturing technologies, we look at, so it's not just generative AI, but in this, what I showed allows us to isolate generative AI. But that's kind of how we see it. So it's really about the question that I think where we work is, how do I achieve my business goals with the skills to the skills that I have? Do I have the right ones? And am I set up for the future? Am I thinking correctly about the future? Because if you think about just the cost benefit of, okay, I don't need as many accountants as my example, therefore I'm going to make them redundant. Oh, I need lots of data scientists, I'll go and recruit them, right? The cost of redundancy in one hand and the cost of hiring in what is a very hot market is crazy compared to, I can take 300 people and see how many of them want to become data scientists, and by the way, I only have to spend a small amount of money on the skilling approach compared to the other two, right? It makes a lot of sense. And so trying to put those strategic foresight sort of pieces in play for an organization, that's what we try and help do.
I think that's a really great point, Ollie, around the idea of, it's just too expensive to be able to just buy talent every time you've got a skills gap, right? The days of only trying to buy or borrow talent, it's just not sustainable right now. And I think a great statistic that shows this is a recent US labor market report shows that there are 6 open roles for every qualified human who could do that job, right? And that report came out at a time where you would have said there was an economic downturn, right? All of the metrics in the US were suggesting that it was a tight economic environment, which has never happened before, because typically in economic downturn, unemployment is high. But actually, if you look at the data from last year, we had the highest or some of the lowest unemployment rates in 50 years in US and in Europe in a tightening market. And so it does really raise the question that our biggest problem isn't robots taking over all of our jobs. Our biggest problem is a lack of humans qualified to do the jobs that we need to be able to do. And so there really is an imperative for driving that upskilling and reskilling, and the data that Ollie shared really reinforces that.
Brilliant.
That does points very real, and it does pose other questions, which maybe certainly not for this session and maybe not even for us, but around the impact on society of how do we distribute wealth appropriately, how do we think about parity across organizations, because you're squeezing certain areas into certain things with polarization of technology. So there's some big economic and societal questions that still need to be answered. And, you know, we have to react to some of those because we're not in the seats. But I do keep my eye on that quite closely because I think it's important for us to contribute to that conversation.
I mean, Nelson, you said that to me before, but if people can't build the skills they need, they run the risk of becoming sort of socially and economically irrelevant. So it's to Ollie's point there, it's massively important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what got you know, I know me and the founders of HowNow into this was that is a very real problem. I mean, when you say socially and economically relevant, we probably all know friends, family members who are not investing in their skills development. So at some point, we'll struggle to get certain jobs and therefore maintain their lifestyle, and they won't be able to live in the areas they're living now and support the lifestyle that they do. And that's a very real and scary problem, right? Yeah.
I was going to say that I've got, you know, one of the anecdotes that goes along with the data, right? Always helpful when you do these things. But my brother-in-law, very successful, been a lawyer, been a entrepreneur, run a couple of businesses, done various things, and he's sort of working out what he wants to do. And one of the things he said was, I think I could be a copywriter. And this is sort of 12 months ago. And I said, well, I don't think that's a great idea. Not because you're not a great copywriter, but because, frankly, I don't see that being a skill that's going to be in high demand, you know, as it goes over the next 5 years. Like, it's going to be declining. Yes, of course, there'll be copywriters that we need for them, but not in the same level or same type, same frequency. So I was like, I don't know. That's a great call. And it's that sort of information that people need to help them. You know, that might be an obvious one, but there's other things that we need to be able to help arm people with so they can make great choices about their careers.
Brilliant. Thank you both. We've come exactly to time. So thanks for sharing so much great information. We packed it all in the end. Massive thank you to everyone for joining us and leaving such great questions and thoughts in the chat. And if you're watching the recording of this, and you want to know more, you missed a live poll, then just reply to the email through which the recording was sent to you, or just look in the description for this on YouTube. There'll be links to Pearson and HowNow there. So thank you both, and we'll see you again next time.